The 77th session of the UN General Assembly is underway in New York, and today marks day one of the high-level general debate, during which heads of government take to the stage to share their thoughts on relevant matters. So what speeches have made headlines over the years? Why does Brazil always speak first? And what have been the ripple effects of these UN addresses? Hello and welcome to the second edition of Issues and Insiders, a daily panel discussion on current affairs shaping the society we share. Today we take a look at some of the speeches by leaders on the UN stage. For more, I have Kwon Soa with me here in the studio. Soa, it's great to have you here.
Happy to be here, Sunny.
I also have Thomas Maresca with us. Thomas, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Right, so let's start with you then. Let's begin with a few words on the order of the speeches at the UN General Assembly, including why Brazil always goes first.
Right. Brazil goes first, the US goes second. That's the basic order. And from then on, there are a number of factors that decide the order of the speakers. Now, let me start with why Brazil goes first every year. It's just tradition since 1955, because back then, Brazil was simply the only country that volunteered to go first when no one else wanted to go first. And it might seem like the US could be a more logical first goer as the host state, but it was kind of reluctant to go first because it didn't want to show the image of, having maybe control over the UN. And it was actually obvious for everyone that the US's speech is kind of the highlight, so it didn't want to add up to that kind of image. And there are some exceptions, though, to the order. For instance, this year, US President Joe Biden will not go as the second speaker, but he'll speak on Wednesday, not on Tuesday. That's because of a delay of a schedule, because of the funeral that he attended, the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. So we'll have President Jair Bolsonaro from Brazil to go first, followed by Senegal's President Macky Sall. Now, the order after these two, according to the UN, that's a little bit more complicated, based on the representation, the level of representation, preference, and also other criteria such as a geographic balance. But basically, simply said, we have the presidents, monarchs go first, then the prime ministers, and usually by the end, the foreign ministers.
Right, I see. And that being said then, Thomas, do tell us a bit about this year's theme and the host of issues likely to be addressed.
Well, the official theme of the general debate is a watershed moment, solutions to interlocking challenges, something like that. And, it's hard to overstate. I mean, watershed moment, it's almost a moment of global crisis that the UN General Assembly hasn't seen in, probably since at least the Cold War. The war in Ukraine is probably the overarching theme, but that has spilled over into major issues like food crisis, food security, worries about energy prices around the world, and just, the whole host of issues, climate crisis, things that have been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic ahead of time. So really, there's so much on the table this time, and in a sense, it's almost a crisis of confidence or a question of legitimacy about the UN. I mean, this is what the UN is supposed to be about, is kind of getting all these countries to work together, and these are such massive problems to solve. And at this moment, maybe things are farther apart than we've seen in a long time, at least in terms of the great powers. So, there'll be the debates, but there will also be sideline. There's a lot that goes on the sideline. So some of those questions I think are going to come up in terms of, the UN Security Council ministers are going to hold a meeting to discuss what to do about Russia, to hold them accountable. There's some questions about maybe trying to hold China accountable for Xinjiang. So there's a lot on the plate, but we'll see what happens. Yeah.
Right, indeed. Now, Soa, beyond the order and the gist of the speeches, over the past years, quite a number of leaders have taken this UN platform to shed light on rather controversial matters. One such individual in the past would be Cuba's Fidel Castro, right?
Right, Sunny. The UN General Assembly is probably one of the best platforms to stage drama. It's not only in terms of contents, because you can actually talk about anything you want there, but also in terms of length. Now, there's a voluntary time limit of around 15 minutes that each speaker can speak, but usually it's common for speeches to run longer. And the longest one on record by a head of state was former Cuban leader Fidel Castro, who spoke for 269 minutes. So that's roughly 18 times longer than the recommended time. And most of the 4.5 hours were filled with denouncements against the U.S. And also one drama that maybe many will remember is Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who started with banging his fists on the table and later also taking off his shoe, and again, more banging on the table.
Right, indeed. Thomas, there was also a rather dramatic display of defiance in 2009, that would be, by then Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, who took to the stage. Could you tell us a bit about that particular event?
Yeah, that was also quite a, commented upon appearance. I think he spoke for around 1 hour and 40 minutes or so. And he basically used the whole time to attack pretty much everything about the UN, the whole premise of it. He really called the Security Council a terror council. He, held the UN Charter up. He ripped some pages from it and tossed the book. He just really, demanded reparations for African countries of $7 trillion. He called George Bush, he said he should be a war criminal. He raised conspiracy theories about the JFK assassination and Martin Luther King. The funny / ironic thing is the one thing he was really positive about was this was also the first year that President Obama was appearing, and Obama spoke right before Gaddafi, actually, and Gaddafi praised Obama, saying, it was great to see the first time an African American was in the White House. He should be president forever. But, his whole act sort of overshadowed Obama's appearance, I think, so ironically enough.
Right. And staying with U.S. President Soa, former U.S. President Donald Trump also caused quite a stir in the year 2017 when he resorted to name-calling, right?
Right. It was not as dramatic as Gaddafi and Castro, but also Trump's first speech to the UN General Assembly made headlines. He called the country's leader a rocket man, none other than North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, who's probably the only leader who never appears at the UN. And Trump, let me just read out the quote by Trump. He said, "The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime." But the North's representative to the UN at the assembly back then didn't get to hear those words in person because North Korea's ambassador to the UN, Ta Sung-nam, walked out of the room before Trump's speech in a boycott against the US, and he just left a junior diplomat there as a representative.
Right, so essentially Donald Trump used the UN platform to threaten another country. Thomas, what was the national response to Trump's remarks at the time?
Well, I think, it just further hardened perhaps opinions about him. He didn't really do much to bridge any divide about, feelings about him. I mean, I think for his supporters, I don't know so much anything specifically with his policies, but his tone was one of defiance. He also kind of attacked the premise of the UN and global institutions in general. And I think his supporters, that's what they liked, thumbing your nose at the global elites and kind of, he also really hammered home this idea of America first and nationalism as his stance, which I think some maybe were waiting to see how far he would take that in that international context. And, for the people that held opposite views of him, I think it alarmed them to some extent. I mean, certainly the words he exchanged with Kim Jong-un and some of his other just, this go it alone attitude, I think caused concern in terms of, the problems that, people who support the UN believe need to be addressed multilaterally, so he kind of sort of framed the US as abdicating a leading role in a lot of these issues and kind of almost having this transactional approach to foreign policy, which he, continued
right, during his term in office, of course. So let's shift gears then. Aside from these less commendable displays, if I may, there have been some memorable moments on the UN stage. And that being said, precisely on this day, that will be September 20th last year, a K-pop group graced the UN stage, right?
Yes, and that's none other than BTS. After becoming the first K-pop group to make a speech at the UN in 2018, the more recent appearance, as you said, a year ago, drew some 1 million people online to watch the boy group on the podium of the UN General Assembly. That was the 76th session. Special Presidential Envoy for Future Generations and Culture. That was their title that they got from President Moon Jae-in, former President Moon Jae-in back then, with whom the K-pop sensation participated together in a Sustainable Development Goals Moment meeting, which is a major event marking the beginning of the General Assembly High-Level Week. And in its speech, the band touched upon the environment, reflected on the disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, but they also expressed their thoughts on a hopeful future and especially addressing the younger generations. Also on that occasion, a video clip of the group's performance was played, Permission to Dance, where they actually started inside the assembly hall and then they gradually moved out of the hall and danced with other people together.
Right, it was quite a show. It was quite a show. Thomas, youth climate activist Greta Thunberg also delivered a poignant, rather powerful speech to world leaders back in the year 2019. What were the ripple effects, that is, of her speech?
Well, I think, yeah, she was another person who didn't play by the kind of conventions of the National Assembly. I mean, she spoke with, an anger and a moral clarity. I think that maybe that's the most powerful thing. In a sense, it helped to define the issue of climate change in this kind of personal and moral urgency context of a young person telling world leaders.
I know, how dare you, she says.
Yeah, she said, how dare you? And she said that it was a betrayal and we will never forgive you and you are failing us. And I think, people talk about there's a Greta Thunberg effect that really means, people who are familiar with her start to think, even I as an individual can do something, I can be involved. Climate is such an enormous topic, and to see just one person kind of address it with such urgency, I think that, has been said to kind of inspire others to think that they can do something in the face of this enormous crisis. I mean, I think maybe some leaders, it may have helped put some pressure on them. I mean, it wasn't just at the UN Assembly. She did a lot of work outside. She led a giant climate strike just days before that. So I think for some leaders that were responsive, they reacted to the pressure as well.
Right. And so back to this year's gathering, I hear the UN earlier took to a vote to allow Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to share a pre-recorded speech. Could you explain this for us?
Right. The 193-member assembly voted 101-7 in favor of President Zelensky using that format. There were 19 abstentions, and those that were against were Russia, obviously, Belarus, Cuba, North Korea, Eritrea, Nicaragua, and Syria. So the speech is expected to be held on Wednesday local time in a pre-recorded format. The quite obvious reason, which Ukraine's UN mission explained, was that Zelensky cannot make it in person to New York because the ongoing Russian aggressions in his country. So he has to stay with the Ukrainian military. What we're expecting to hear on the screen is he will have a lot to say, as it is the first time the UN General Assembly is held since Russia invaded Ukraine. And Sergei Kyslytsya, the UN envoy of Ukraine, said that Zelensky will talk about, quote, how he sees the end of this war and how he evaluates the impact of this war on global affairs and on the United Nations in particular. So he's probably going to garner support from the international community, which, apart from himself, actually will be back in person at the event in such a big scale for the first time in 3 years. So it's going to be pretty influential.
And this is going to take place on Wednesday, which is also the day that Biden will give his address. And very briefly speaking, Thomas, what issues do you suppose he's going to bring up?
I think probably the war in Ukraine will be at the top of his list, maybe just to kind of try to continue to rally support, for all the measures against the Ukraine. And, they're coming off of a successful period in Ukraine, so to kind of keep the momentum going, maybe to try and bring other people into other countries into the fold, and maybe just to frame this kind of democracy versus autocracy framing that he's really spent a lot of time in his presidency.
Right.
Discussing.
And Soa, what issues will President Yoon Suk-yeol bring up? His speech is scheduled for this Tuesday.
Yes, this Tuesday he'll be the 10th speaker. It's going to be his debut on the UN. And President Yoon is expected to highlight the importance of cooperation and solidarity among democratic countries, and also touch upon global supply issues and economic security. But of course, also he's going to talk about North Korea. So the Yoon administration's North Korea policy will likely come up, the so-called audacious plan, which focuses on giving aid to North Korea for exchange of denuclearization steps. So that's what we expect.
Right, so we will also have to continue to wait and see that. All right, so as always, thank you very much for that. And Thomas, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you.